Today we're going to be reviewing the Stokke Trailz, our current top pick for the heavyweight class of strollers, which I also sometimes think of as Cadillac strollers. The reason being that when you're pushing a stroller like the Trailz, it feels an awful lot to me like driving a luxury car. It's big and smooth and a little heavy, but in a good way. Like the sheer mass of the thing provides safety. The Trailz clocks it at around 14 kilos. It's 63 by 50 by 95 centimeters when you fold it down. It takes 10 kilos in the underslung shopping basket, and according to EU regulations, it's officially reported as taking 15 kilos in the seat. But it actually can take more, of course. We'll start with a few notes on comfort, both for you and your child. Stokke, like Bugaboo, really aims high when it comes to comfort. Both the bassinet and the seat are of a decent size. I'd say that compared to the market in general, the bassinet is a bit larger than average, while the seat hits more or less middle of the road. One thing you'll notice with either, in comparison to pretty much every other heavyweight stroller that I can think of, is that the seat and bassinet sit a lot higher than average on the chassis. This is nice for a couple reasons. Firstly, it brings your child closer to you, making it easier to fetch bottles and pacifiers and such. And secondly, it makes it a lot easier to access the spacious shopping basket, even with the bassinet attached, which is not true of a lot of strollers. Regarding the chassis itself, all the buttons and triggers, with the exception of one point, which I'll get to later, are both intuitive and very comfortable to access and activate. The chassis folds down easily, though you do need to remove the seat or bassinet. Driving-wise, this stroller is awesome. In fact, if you've seen any of our other videos, you may have guessed that driving characteristics, in particular on rougher terrain, hits pretty high on our list of importance. Unlike a lot of other strollers that claim to function off-road, but don't, the Trailz actually does. Despite all these pluses, there are a few negatives to point out comfort-wise. Firstly, the Trailz is both large and heavy, which need not be a bad thing if you don't have a car or need to drag it regularly up and down flights of stairs. Regarding trunk space in particular, the chassis and seat combined will not really fit in the trunk of tiny cars at all. They'll take up all your trunk space in a medium-sized car and fill up at least half of the trunk in most SUVs. In addition, the Trailz takes a bit of maintenance to keep it running properly. It has air-filled tires to pump or replace inner tubes, and it requires occasional lubrication in several key mechanisms. And the textiles are not the easiest to remove for a wash. They're not that hard to remove, but still, it's a process you might have to look up to do properly. Okay, let's have a look at the mechanisms now top to bottom, starting with the handle and the central fold. The handle height is adjusted via this pivoting function here. That's a common mechanism for a lot of strollers. It's done quite sturdily on the Trailz, but be aware that after a few years, this probably won't sit quite as tight as when you first buy it. It's not an area that tends to break on this model though. Below the pivoting height adjustment mechanism is this telescopic mechanism. This has more to do with when you fold down the stroller. Anytime you have this sort of a telescopic mechanism, it means that internally you're going to have wires or pins and connection points which can occasionally break. That can sometimes be a problem with this model, though generally isn't. And it doesn't actually use a wire inside, it uses a thick metal pin, so you don't actually have to worry about the wire itself breaking. When you get down to the central fold, this is actually quite a simple system. When you pull up on this, a metal peg that is poking into a divot in the back frame, it pulls out and allows it to fold forward. So it's not an overly complicated mechanism, and again, also one that doesn't tend to have that many problems. Stokke in general does a lot with redesigning the various mechanisms of all of their models, but the Trailz included, regularly, not just whenever they release a new version officially. So that means that as it rolls through the production line, all of the mechanisms on the stroller are generally becoming improved. Okay, we'll have a little look at the back end. Two things I would point out then on there are the brake system. Brake system recently went through an overhauling because sometimes it was sticking against the wheels, and now it no longer has that problem. They've changed the contour on the pins that poke out into the wheels. It's a very solid, very simple sort of a system, all activated by this brake lever on one side. Sends pins out into both of the wheel housing mechanisms and directly into the wheels themselves. One of the coolest functions on this stroller, which you're not going to see on a lot of heavyweight strollers or a lot of strollers in general, is this big assembly here. This is for suspension, and having a large dedicated suspension unit, this involves springs and just heavy metal plates in order to keep the suspension very perfect here. That's going to really, really matter when it comes to off-road capability, and it's one of our key reasons why we like the Trailz is because of the actual off-road capability that the stroller has. Having a look at the front end, there are three things I would point out which also very much improve its ability to drive on terrain. Firstly, there's a certain amount of inbuilt suspension into the fork that's actually quite common on front swivel wheel sort of strollers. Secondly is that it has 10-inch front wheels. A lot of stroller manufacturers opt for going for an 8-inch front wheel, and having that increased size is going to count a lot for getting over terrain. And lastly, take the wheel out, you'll notice that there is this big, fat suspension pad here. And what that does is it presses the fork up tightly against the front end so that the axle over time does not wear down the housing on the inside and cause a wobbling problem. That's a very positive effect with the Trailz. I have seen it also on the Boogaboo Buffalo and a few other models, but it's definitely a very sturdily built suspension pad that you have here. The one downside on the front end, I would say, is the locking, swivel lock mechanism, and that is really the only button on the entire chassis that's not particularly comfortable to use. It's a bit tough to pull up, and it's not that ergonomic for the fingers. Other than that though, it does function quite well. In terms of the wheels in general, again, I would point out that it has the 10-inch front wheels, which is quite nice. It does have air-filled tires, and so there are pluses and minuses to this. But the reason they've obviously gone for it is, in addition to the suspension on the back end, the air-filled tire does also give a certain amount of suspension for going over bumps. So even though you have to fill the tires sometimes with air or change out the tires in the inner tubes, it is worthwhile for that overall driving capability. Now you can buy the Trailz also with the classic wheels, but I would caution against this because on the classic wheels you then of course lose that added terrain bonus from having air-filled tires, but also they're of a little bit lighter quality and they have a foam that you can that tends to on occasion get pebbles and stones stuck in it and wear down a little bit faster. The axle system is also not quite as strong as on the terrain wheels. So my preference is for the terrain wheels when you're going for the Trailz. In general though, the wheels are of a very high quality as well on this model. So is the Trailz right for you? As I mentioned at the beginning, this is one of our favorite strollers, but it's of course not for everybody. I would say that size, weight, and price would be the main reasons for choosing something else, unless maybe you need something with even more terrain capability, like a three-wheeler. Barring these factors though, in my mind, there really is very little reason not to choose the Trailz, as it excels in pretty much every area one might judge a stroller for. Basically, as long as you don't need to pack it in and out of a car regularly, and you don't live in a top floor apartment without any elevator, there's no real reason not to choose the Trailz. It drives great everywhere, it's well engineered and easy to use, and it's right up there at the top in terms of comfort and luxury. In any case, we hope that you found this video interesting, and if you did, we ask that you subscribe, as it helps us continue making videos in the future. Thank you.